Welcome back. This week's topic, the causes of poverty. Although every week we bring together the best and the brightest, we've really outdone ourselves this week. We have an unusually distinguished group of contributors, each laying out a key cause of poverty. And each of those causes then has implications for how we might go about reducing poverty. As a backdrop to this discussion, David and I thought we should engage in a bit of ground clearing. We want to expose some common myths. Myths that insofar as you subscribe to them, may make it difficult for you to fully appreciate the videos that follow.
I'm going to start off with a myth that might be called the nothing can be done myth. With this myth, poverty is seen as immutable and timeless. It's always been with us, and it always will be, despite all that we've thrown at it, including the long and protracted war on poverty. This is why last week's primer on poverty measurement was so important. It should be recalled that the OPM only takes cash benefits into account, which means that some of the country's most important poverty-fighting programs, like the EITC, are simply ignored when the OPM is calculated. So what happens when we use a poverty measure, like the supplemental poverty measure, that does take non-cash benefits into account? What we see is that poverty has declined, not precipitously, but it has declined. The larger conclusion here is that the safety net is doing poverty-reducing work. It might seem obvious that it is, but the nothing can be done myth is so frequently rehearsed that it's important to look dispassionately at the facts, making it clear that the myth is just that, nothing but a myth.
Look, David, I appreciate that some conservatives have argued that anti-poverty policy does nothing, and that it's fairly easy to reveal, as you just have, the flaws of that argument. But what about the liberals' favorite assumption, that the only way to reduce poverty is to engage in ever more redistribution? Liberals often argue that the best or only way to reduce poverty further is to engage in even more redistribution, to raise taxes on top income earners, and to spend more on programs for the poor. The idea here is to have more homeless shelters, more government subsidized housing, and more generous welfare payments for the poor. It's of course true that the US engages in much less redistribution than other rich countries. And if we want to be like those countries, then the liberals are right. We need to engage in more redistribution. But it's also important to point out that there are many different ways to take on poverty. Although one way to do so would indeed be an expansion of our redistribution programs, another way to go about it would be to reform our labor market institutions. We could reduce unemployment via a jobs program or a stimulus package, or through innovation-inspiring research and development. We can make college free, and thus reduce the number of low-skilled workers who are chasing after the few available low-skilled jobs. And finally, we could increase the minimum wage. So there's a choice to make. We can either reduce poverty by tinkering with our economy and our labor market institutions in ways that affect the employment rate and the size of workers' paychecks, or we can let the labor market stand and engage in even more aftermarket redistribution. We're not saying that one is better than another. That's a matter for science and research. We're simply emphasizing that there are many ways to take on poverty. We ought not blithely accept the myth, promulgated by many liberals, that redistribution is the only way to take on poverty.
This leads us to the third myth, a myth that says that poverty is a deeply complicated affair, indeed so complicated and interwoven into the fabric of society that we just can't take it on. The idea here is that poverty will remain with us until we find that elusive magic bullet cure. In effect, this is the disease model of poverty, a model that treats poverty like a rare form of cancer that we don't yet understand and that calls for more research. How did we come to believe that poverty is such an impossibly complicated affair? Here's an answer. We've confused causes with consequences. The consequences of poverty indeed are relatively complicated, but the causes are quite straightforward. Indeed, we have a good science of poverty, and if we wanted to take it on, we could. It's worth pursuing this point with a more protracted upstream-downstream metaphor. So let's suppose that there's an upstream lumber mill that pollutes the river running through it and causes all sorts of downstream health problems. The downstream population faces burgeoning rates of depression, cognitive dysfunction, asthma, and so on. How do we address this health disaster? The downstream approach entails taking on the problem by hiring epidemiologists to establish a statistical relationship between exposure and health, and clinicians to train affected families to minimize exposure and identify early symptoms, and special education teachers to train those with cognitive dysfunction, and physicians to diagnose and treat the ill. And finally, social workers, to dispense disability payments and other benefits. The downstream approach is indeed complicated and costly. The alternative, of course, is the upstream solution. If we'd rather not hire workers to repair or remediate all this harm, we always have the far cheaper option of reducing the pollution itself. A contrived example? Hardly. The vast anti-poverty apparatus that we've built up is not unlike the downstream approach to remediating pollution. We have social scientists teasing out the multifarious effects of poverty. We have clinicians, social workers, childcare workers, all providing compensatory care to poor children. We have teachers addressing learning disabilities caused by poverty. We have social workers dispensing payments and benefits to the poor. And we have police and prison guards regulating and warehousing the poor. What's complicated then is the downstream response to the consequences of poverty. When you watch these videos, I encourage you therefore to make a list of the key causes of poverty and consider how, if we wished, they might be addressed. So don't confuse causes with consequences. The consequences are quite complicated, but the causes are relatively straightforward.
So here's the lineup for this week's videos. We're going to start with a video by Jack Shonkoff, which shows how poverty literally gets under the skin of the children exposed to it. Next, James Heckman is going to tell us about the economic returns to early childhood education. And then Patrick Sharkey is going to talk about how poverty becomes even worse when combined with extreme segregation. Finally, Ann Stevens talks about labor market policy and how our labor market generates poverty. As you listen to these videos, it's useful to reflect on how they speak to the myths that we've just referred to, how they discount them, and then how they suggest an exciting new positive science of poverty.